and welcome to those that have been teaching it for a little while now. The best thing about these sessions is that you get to ask all your questions to the author team. And we have the lovely Catherine Medici here with us today, and she's going to take over in a minute. I'm Sarah Ruddock. I'm part of the Bloomsbury Classical Studies team. Oh, hang on, I'll just turn on my video. I just realised that you can't see me. Helps if you can see me, doesn't it? There you go. I'm Sarah Ruddock, and I'm part of the Bloomsbury Classical Studies team. And I run these termly webinars with the author team so that we can cover all the basics of getting started with De Romanis and any other questions that you have as we go along in the year. So if you have any other topics that you'd like us to cover, then please do email me, sarah.ruddock@bloomsbury.com, and we can get those set up for you. So we're all here to support you. So just a few housekeeping notes from me. Microphones are muted at the moment, and if you could turn your cameras off, that'd be great, just so we can see the presentation as we go along. We've got a 45-minute session today, so we'll have 30 odd minutes of Catherine talking through, and then we will have the last 20 minutes or so to talk through any Q&A that you may have. We've had some questions in already, but if you have any as we go through, then just put them in the chat box and I can ask at the end, or you can come off if you're brave enough and ask yourself. So I'm going to hand over so that I'm not talking the whole way through, and I will see you at the end. Catherine, are you happy to share your screen?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm hoping it's going to deftly appear in a moment. Are we there? Does that look like you can see my slideshow?
Absolutely, yeah.
Brilliant. Good. So we're oh, can you? I'm sorry that I'm having a huge amount of feedback. Sorry, is that sounding okay to you, Sarah? Is that sounding okay? I'll hope it's sounding okay. Right, I'll just start and hope for the best.
Sorry, I realise I'm on mute. No, it's sounding fine now.
Oh,
yeah,
fine.
There was an echo, but you're fine.
Good, brilliant. So thank you all so much for coming along. It's really nice to get a chance to talk to people and answer questions. And what we thought we'd do is run this webinar with a focus on the grammar, in particular in chapters 1 and 2, because it's probably at the start of a course, and particularly this course, that De Romanis will feel most different from courses you might be used to using before, especially if that was the reading course approach in the CRC. And I've put as my opening slide the title, Cases, 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 ah! And when I was writing this on Sunday, one of my kids looked at me and said, why on earth have you written the word ah in your opening slide? I said, I've done this because really that is the word that's always in my mind when it comes to case endings in Latin, because case endings in Latin are an absolute nightmare, really. And what I thought I would do, therefore, is with that in view, talk through, first of all, why I think they are more difficult than verbs. Because as teachers, if we understand where the barriers are, we can always teach better around them. Secondly, why, given they're so difficult, why on earth are there so many adjectives and declensions in just 2 chapters, which I'm sure will be a question on many people's lips. And in that context, what then is the best way to teach them? And finally, what we think is the benefit of the learn by case approach, as opposed to going down declension tables in the way that has always been traditional in classical education in this country. So that's going to be the structure of this opening presentation. And then at the end of that, we'll go a bit free flow into questions. So to begin with then, the idea of cases and why they are more difficult than verbs. Because I think it's always worth, as a teacher, asking yourself, what is it that students find difficult and why? Because it's not the case that all of grammar is equally difficult. And we know that because, for example, students typically recognise an imperfect tense quite straightforwardly, but when it gets to e.g. the present or the future, they probably don't. So it's not the case that endings per se are always hard. It's the case that some endings are harder than others. And cases, I would say, are at the raw end of the difficult part of Latin grammar, really for the following 4 reasons. The first is that when we deal with cases, we deal with a huge number of labels. And when we teach cases, sometimes those labels kind of blur and smudge in students' minds. So we cannot teach cases without talking about declension, the word case itself, nominative, accusative, subject or object. And sometimes in our explanation of one of those labels, we end up using another label to explain the first. And if we're not very careful, students can end up kind of lost in a sludge of terminology. The second problem with case endings, and this particularly applies actually when you move beyond the nominative and accusative cases and get into the ablative and the genitive and the dative, is that the case endings are dominated by vowels. And that would be difficult anyway, because the human memory tends to lock onto consonantal patterns much better than the vowel patterns, because the vowels are all the open mouth sounds that are just less fixed in the human ear. But it's particularly problematic in Latin because the pronunciation of Latin vowels does not match English spelling. And so whereas in class, if we talk about imperfect verb endings, bam, bas, bat, that immediately matches the look of the endings. If I talk about the case ending I or E, actually, how does that pan onto spelling? And it's possible for students to end up in a bit of a pickle. It's also the case that for these endings, there's too much overlap. And I keep going back to, why is bam, bas, bat one of the easiest endings for students to learn? And it's because nothing else looks like it. It's like, actually, it's quite straightforward at a high level for students to recognise a gerund or gerundive, maybe not to tell them apart, but to recognise it is at least a gerund or gerundive, because nothing else looks like it. When it comes to the case endings, too many things look like them, and too many of the case endings look like each other. And grammar is always more difficult when you're into a kind of setup where it's a horrible Venn diagram with a whole load of stuff in the intersection that seemingly could go either way. But the final reason why case endings are more difficult than e.g. verb endings, and this is one I think that often gets overlapped, is that on the whole, when dealing with cases and dealing with nouns and adjectives, the English doesn't really change. And that's something as teachers, I think sometimes we don't pause to think about enough. Because you see, when you're doing verb endings and you're teaching, e.g., again, I mentioned bam, bas, bat, the English changes as well. And so you can say, look, what bam is I was loving. And there's a tangible link between that ending and something in English that gives it meaning. But if I'm trying to teach the accusative case and I say, right, here is a noun, God, and here it is in the accusative case, it still means God. And although when we get to the genitive and dative and ablative, in a sense, the meaning changes, because you might want to add in the words to, for, by, with, from, etc., the actual noun itself, God, is still the same in English. And because the English doesn't really change, and this applies especially to adjectives, actually, because adjectives don't really even change if it's singular or plural, with the exception perhaps of much and many. Because the English doesn't really change, it means that often students don't really know what the case endings are all about. And it also means that no matter how much we as teachers might bang on about them, because the English doesn't really change, students tend to learn to ignore them in practice. We all know that. You can get right up to GCSE Latin with a very kind of vague knowledge of case endings indeed. Students kind of can get a very long way without them. And because they're not necessarily using them in the way that, we as purists might suggest, well, yes, you should, the knowledge of case endings doesn't necessarily stick with the solidity that we might like it to. So in that context, the obvious question would be to say, well, hang about. If we're saying that case endings are more difficult than verb endings, and difficult for those reasons, why on earth are there so many of them in chapters 1 and 2? And it's a very legitimate question to ask, and it's one that's very useful to be able to go into to some degree of depth. And the reasons why there are so many of them in chapters 1 and 2 really fall into two camps. The first is that pragmatically, there kind of had to be, because once we set up the structure of the chapters and we thought actually chapter 1 on gods is going to be a great opener, and then the obvious place to go to next is a chapter on heroes, what that meant was that in chapter 1, as soon as you construct chapter 1 about gods, the 3 declensions become completely essential, because goddess is first declension, God is second declension, and all of the gods that we talk about other than Minerva are in the third declension. And it was also the case that if we were going to tell stories about those gods, the stories would have been mighty dull if we didn't have any adjectives. So on a purely pragmatic basis, the 3 declension approach was essential to chapter 1 in order to be able to construct the Latin that was going to relate to the theme. And similarly, when we moved into chapter 2, as soon as we wanted to talk about Roman heroes, adjectives like fortis, audax, and ingens became really important, as did also nouns like armour, bellum, and periculum. It would have been very hard to tell the stories that we kind of wanted to tell without those words. And that then opened up the necessity of thinking, let's deal with the neuters, and let's deal with third declension adjectives, and maybe let's deal with both of those types. So that's one of the reasons. But actually, the truth of it is, although pragmatically we went in that direction, we also sat and thought long and hard about it. And actually, educationally, I decided it would be a good idea. And I think it's possibly counterintuitive, because anybody who's used to teaching the Cambridge Latin course approach sort of thinks the more grammar, the harder it gets, hold it back. But educationally, there are, I think, once we're used to doing it, some really significant benefits to introducing adjectives as early as we do, the number of declensions that we do, and indeed actually putting the kind of whole lot of adjectives out to the fore, warts and all, by the end of chapter 2. And the educational reasons as to why I think it's useful are as listed on this screen. The first is that bringing adjectives into chapter 1 gave us one massive advantage, which was that we could introduce the principles of agreement in the context of a chapter where every single noun had an obvious gender. The second advantage it brought was that the grammar could be practiced before the vocab got too complex. And really, when constructing a language textbook, one has to go one of two ways. Either you build a lot of vocab first and then do the grammar later, at which point you're trying to practice grammar in the context of a knowledge base of vocabulary, which is inevitably going to be known to differing extents across the cohort. Or you bring grammar in very early with a very limited number of words, where your knowledge of those words is going to be higher because there's fewer of them. And if you do it that way, then you take out the barrier, which is the complexity of whether or not the students know the words in the sentence, and it leaves more of the mental load free to think about the mechanics of how those words are working. But the final reason, and this is probably the most counterintuitive of the lot, the final reason why I decided to put both types of third declension adjectives in at once, because actually I could have constructed the chapter with just one type, the real reason I did it was because adjectival agreement is indeed tricky. But the thing about it is this: the natural linguists actually soak it up very fast. And for the natural linguists, setting the stall out in full at the start means that every single word they meet, and every time they get a chance to practice it in subsequent chapters, you're going back to exactly the same framework, because the framework was there in full from the outset. And there's been quite a lot of educational research that talks about the importance of the superstructure. And the superstructure of grammar is the categories of words that exist. And if the top end students know from the outset, okay, there are 3 types of adjectives. It's either a 2-1-2 or it's a third declension. And if it's a third declension, there are these 2 little differences really between the 2 types. Then they're going to be constantly plugging material back into that framework, and it will help the overall framework be more solid as they move forward and the language progresses. But if you only do a bit of the framework at once, and then you kind of warp the framework by changing it further on, that can actually create confusion and complication. So for the top end, there's definitely a benefit. But that said, when we wrote this book, one of the things that motivated me was to make sure Latin was not a subject only for the top end. And I really wanted to create a book which facilitated Latin across all levels of the ability cohort. And here is probably the most counterintuitive thing of all, and that is for the less able linguists, the one for whom adjectival agreement is always going to be a right fiddle faff, is that if you do it in one fell swoop in chapter 2, it means you don't have to get bogged down in it. And actually, the not getting bogged down in it is going to be one of the most important principles I try and bring to the fore in this webinar. There's going to be the idea that actually it's possible to do adjectives at the opening of the course with an extremely light touch and then move on. And if we had drip fed, here's another type of adjective, here's another type of adjective, now we have to relearn them all because now we've got neuters. If I kind of drip fed it doing like that, the worry would have been that lessons had to keep on coming back to this awkward and difficult ground, and actually better to move past it and not get stuck in terrain which maybe doesn't exactly fill every single student full of grammatical joy. So that was the rationale. Obviously, then the next question is, what's the best way to teach them? Given that we've got this potential difficulty in chapters 1 and 2, which might be great for the top end and useful for them. And given that I'm saying actually with that difficulty as teachers, we need to be ready to step past it in a way that's also going to bring in the middle and the bottom end. Well, to set out the kind of thinking behind the best way to teach them, we have to go back really to the principles, the construction principles within De Romanis. And De Romanis, as I say, is very, very different in ideology than the Cambridge Latin course. And it's built around 4 really important principles. The first of them is that Latin has a longer shelf life educationally if we can use it to support the wider curriculum, not just for the love of the subject itself, but as a language which is going to reinforce learning elsewhere. And there are certain grammatical principles in Latin that yield immediate return. And one of those is the principle of adjectival agreement. The basic idea that if the noun is masculine, the adjective is masculine, because that's a principle that is picked up across multiple modern languages. And it's perfectly possible to use chapters 1 and 2 in a way that doesn't necessarily lead to an exact knowledge and recall of the fine-grained details of spellings of the endings, but it absolutely starts to bang the drum of the linguistic principles that are going to support the broader curriculum and reinforce the learning that they're doing in other subjects. The second principle within De Romanis is that as a course, it's been designed to be flexed in order to suit aptitude and indeed interest and attainment. That even though the pages in the textbook look as they do, as a teacher, there is a range of ways you can move through them to teach this content to suit the students who are before you. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we progress. The third principle is that although there is plenty English into Latin work in the additional language, the primary task is Latin into English. And that's the primary task because when they move through to GCSE, that's going to be the primary task. And it's also the task which in the short term kind of yields the greatest enthusiasm and probably greatest reward from your students. What that means is, as a teacher, it's quite important to ask yourself, if the primary task in this course is translation from Latin into English, what do they need to know to facilitate that? Because what you need to know to facilitate translation from Latin into English is quite a different thing from what is there to know in entirety about Latin grammar. And again, I'll get down into the detail of that when I move on to the next slide. And then the final principle within the design of De Romanis is that we built it on a kind of looping around model. I wanted to make sure that whatever a grammatical principle that was introduced at one point, there was opportunity to come back to it and deepen it as you move through the course. Because in my experience, the looping around approach of we did it, we're just going to touch on it again, we're just going to touch on it again, and so on, is where the really long-term understanding builds. It's that old, kind of 7 bites at the cherry before it goes into the long-term memory sort of thing. And as a teacher, it's very important to know that by the time you finish chapters 1 and 2, your students don't need to be oven ready. They don't need to be complete in all their knowledge and understanding of the whole shebang. They certainly don't need to have every single fine-grained ending for cases off pat. What's really helpful is for them to have the seeds of future understanding, those core principles of if the noun is masculine, the adjective is masculine. The spelling of the ending depends upon the declension of the word, and so on. But it's perfectly possible for those to deepen in time. And when they meet the genitive case, when they meet the dative case, when they meet the ablative case, when they do participles, there's plenty of opportunity in the additional language tasks there to practice these principles again. And actually, when you get into the genitive, dative and ablative case, adjectival agreement is much easier because there's no issue with the neuters. So with the nominative and accusative case, it's kind of adjectival agreement in case endings at its worst, because that's where you've got the greatest complexity of possible endings. And when you move into the ablative case in chapter 3, the additional language material and practicing that, most students will find that actually fairly straightforward because you're dealing with just 3 possible endings each time. So picking up then, as I said I would, on this principle of teaching to suit aptitude, and how to flex these course materials in a way that's going to suit the kind of suitable outcomes for your students. And I mentioned in the last slide that one of the key questions as a teacher to ask yourself is, how much do students actually need to know? Because that is always, as I said a few minutes ago, quite different from What is the totality of what could be known? And as classicists, we're often kind of fairly, sticklers for completion. Yeah. And it's very tempting as a classicist to want to teach down the here is everything that could be known route. But actually, if you want to facilitate educational growth, the what you need to know at this stage is a more constructive mindset to have. And although I said at the outset, one of the main reasons why case endings were harder for students to remember than verb endings was because the English doesn't really change. Actually, the fact that the English doesn't really change is a game changer when it comes to what students actually need to know. And I've put on this slide the word, aha, the English doesn't really change, because actually as soon as you realise that, when it comes to translating from Latin into English, adjectives, although they carry this kind of frisson of grammatical complexity, translating from Latin into English, adjectives are an absolute doddle. Because litus, whatever its ending, is going to mean happy. And litus, right up until they get into verse, which is a long way off when they're in key stage 3, litus is probably going to be right next to the noun you need to translate it with. So translation from Latin into English, provided students know the meaning of the vocab, adjectives are not going to rock the boat. They really aren't. And the only time when adjectives are going to cause complexity is when you have adjectives used without nouns, when you need to say laiti, the happy men, or multa, many things. But with that exception, straightforward adjectives used with nouns going from Latin into English rarely actually cause an impediment for translation from Latin into English. And if you're unconvinced by that, the proof of the pudding is Cambridge Latin course got away with not mentioning adjectives until stage 19 for precisely that reason, because you can merrily chug along and read Latin and really not look at the ending of the adjective at all. So with that in mind, what does really matter when you're teaching chapters 1 and 2? When you're navigating that grammatical detail and choosing what am I going to explain in full and what am I going to just push on past and say, look, there's that box there, but actually what you need to know is this. Well, here is my list of the top 3 things out of chapters 1 and 2. The first is that every single step of the way, meaning of the vocab, meaning of the vocab, meaning of the vocab is the single most important thing, especially with nouns and adjectives. And drilling these words, and actually with the adjectives, helping students kind of fall in love with the words is really going to facilitate outcomes. And although, as I say, the adjective endings are not necessarily everyone's kind of choice of grammar detail to teach, the meaning of adjectives is where the sparkle comes into the lesson. Because the adjectives in chapters 1 and 2 on the whole are pretty big blockbuster words, and particularly chapter 1, savage, happy, angry, suddenly the lessons get a kind of depth of colour which help them not be very, 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 very basic. The second thing that's really important is that actually the meaning of the labels, understanding what a declension is, understanding what a stem is, understanding what we mean when we say the word ending, what are we talking about when we talk about agreement, the idea there that if the noun is masculine, the adjective must be masculine, and so on. Teaching those labels is far more important in chapters 1 and 2 than making sure they know the actual spellings of the endings. And the reason why it's far more important is because when you come back to it in future chapters and introduce other cases, it's the labels which structure the explanation of what's going on. And if students don't know the labels, they're not going to know anything at all. So if students leave chapter 1 knowing that a declension is a group of nouns that share the same spellings for their endings, or if students end chapter 1 knowing that the stem is the bit of the word that does not change, and if students end chapters 1 and 2 knowing the basic principles of agreement, they're going to have the framework of understanding, which means you can over time plug more and more of the detail in a way that's going to help it grow stronger and stronger. But if they don't have that framework, that superstructure of the labels, they're going to grind to a halt. And it's also the case that teaching the labels of grammar is going to facilitate their work in other subjects, because when you teach the labels, you're actually building transferable language literacy that helps them understand teaching in other languages as well. And then the final thing when it comes to what matters the most is that out of all those cases, and this applies really throughout the whole course, the case ending that matters more than anything else is actually the accusative case. But the reason why the accusative case matters in a way that the nominative case for translation from Latin to English doesn't so much is because it is only really the accusative case that properly disrupts English word order. And it's the accusative case where students either need to kind of read on and find that verb first, or they need to handle it in a way which is not kind of natural in English. Okay, and at this level, I would absolutely recommend the read on and find the verb and pull it in early. And so students have to kind of trigger when they see that accusative case to change their natural kind of reading order. And therefore, it is 5 times more important that students notice when a noun is accusative than they notice when it's a nominative, because the nominative nouns typically at the start of the sentence are not going to pose any problems for them anyway, because they're at the start where they need to be. And actually, so too with the genitive and dative. The genitive and dative typically sort of sit around in the middle of the sentence in a place that feels quite natural in English, but it's the accusative case that disrupts the English word order, and that's the one, therefore, the students need to recognise most of all. Right, finally then, for the last kind of few minutes of this opening presentation, is to deal with the benefit of the learn by case approach. Because understandably, this raises some questions. It's kind of one of the most different things in De Romanis from what we're all used to. And what I would kind of put to the fore is that the learn by declension methods, chanting down those tables, and Sam, is a vestige from English into Latin. Because when you're going from English into Latin, you have to understand how a word operates in full. And the first thing I need to do if I'm operating a piece of vocab is obviously I know what group it's in, so I know how to spell the endings that it has to take. But from Latin into English, no one ever has to go hunting for a second declension word. What people have to go hunting for when they go from Latin into English is a particular case. And if you learn endings by case, if you learn the accusative case is am, don't forget about the neuters, then actually you kind of have to the fore what you're looking for. And it's also the case that if you learn the accusative case is am, don't forget about the neuters, then cross-declension agreement, spotting that from Latin to English becomes much easier, because you're already used to thinking that am and em can all stick together, and you don't fall into the trap of people thinking that the words are necessarily going to be spelt the same. Third advantage is that the patterns within the case endings become more obvious. It's actually much easier to remember the accusative case. It's am, em, always ends with an m, don't forget about the neuters, and if you learn it all by declensions. The ablative case doesn't get lost. Ablative case is also very important because it's often there at the start of the sentence. You need not to mistake it for a nominative. And because of the learn by case approach, it means you can revise cases in isolation. You can say, right, remind me your ablative cases, remind me your genitive cases, because you don't have to go through all cases every single time. And then the final advantage I'll talk about in a moment is that pupils can actually retrieve the right ending far faster, because ultimately they'll be able to use just one reference table, whatever the word they're dealing with. Now, in all of that, there are 2 key principles that are worth the students having very, very clear in their mind. And the first is that the role of a word in the sentence is what is going to affect the case or drive the case. But the spelling of the case depends upon declension and gender. And actually using this idea of the spelling of the case ending depends upon declension and gender will really help your students when they navigate this table. And on this slide, I put the word that in italics because when we were doing chapter 2, I did and about putting this table in, because this table looks kind of god awful, doesn't it? And I'm still and erring over it. It's a table that looks far less awful when you do the same thing for genitive, dative, ablative. But for nominative and accusative, as I said, it looks a bit awful because that's the place where there's most complexity. There's kind of 2 endings, the second declension, all this business going on with the third declension. But the thing about this table is that students are able to use this table always, regardless of the word. So if I say, right, we need to manipulate the adjective ingens, and I say, let's remember that it's third declension. I say, let's imagine we're going to use it in a sentence where it's got to be accusative. And I say, let's remember that the spelling of the case ending is going to depend upon declension and gender. Then I can think, right, ingens is a third declension word. It's describing a masculine noun. We're obviously going to go down this column, aha, the ending is going to be em. And whatever piece of vocab I put to the fore, how are we going to manipulate the noun hasta? Let's imagine I want to make it nominative plural. Well, the spelling of that ending depends upon declension and gender. Hasta is in the first declension. Here we go in the first declension. There's only one set of options. Happy days. Nominative plural is going to be AE. And although this table looks horrid, if students only ever have to use one and the same table every single time, that's actually a whole load easier than saying, right, we need to manipulate hasta. What is the table just for the first declension? Or we need to manipulate litus. What is the table just for 2-1-2 adjectives? Or we need to manipulate this. What's the table just for that? Because retrieving from one and the same table every single time is a massive source of reassurance for students because it builds in a familiarity of process, which enables outcomes. So there we go. That is the 30-minute presentation concluded. We're over to Q&A. I'm going to come off screen share and pass back to Sarah to compare the Q&A. Right, there we go.
And I was actually going through my list of questions and ticking them off as you were going through, because I think actually you've answered quite a lot of questions that people had in advance, which is always good. I think a lot of teachers have had problems with the declension, third declension, adjectives especially, and I think you've given some great tips there. I just want to state at this time that if anybody would like to come on and ask a questions, and please just unmute and ask away. We've got 15 minutes, so if there was a question that you had that you feel like wasn't answered, then please jump on now. Claire, I think you put a question in the chat. I don't know if it was answered. You had how do you manage the introduction of new vocabulary, mini course books? So I think you covered that.
Well, I can pick on that a little bit more actually, because what I would say with new vocabulary is I'd be willing to give it time. And when I first started teaching, I used to think to myself, the learning of the vocab is the thing the kids can do on their own, the homework. They don't need me to help them learn the vocab. And it wasn't a great approach actually, because of course the kids didn't necessarily learn it for homework. And I've learned to put much more learning into my lessons. And with the vocab, you've got 30 words to learn at the start of a chapter. But if, e.g., you spend 2 to 2.5 weeks on the background content to set up the themes of the chapter, which is really, really worth doing, you can spread those 30 words, into kind of 6 words a lesson, and actually giving 5 minutes at the start of the lesson to write 6 new words. What are they? English derivations. What are they? Play around with the words. What part of speech are they? All the additional language section A exercises. Making learning vocab in lessons and in lesson task is really, really worth it. And actually students, in my experience, respond really well to learning in lessons because they see the immediate return from acquiring knowledge on the spot. So yeah, I would devote a reasonable amount of lesson time to. I mean, I even do kind of class, everyone say hasta, what does it mean? Spear, hasta, spear, hasta, spear, say it 5 times, say it loud, say it quiet, all of that, just putting energy and time in lessons into learning the vocab, because it is the single most important thing as you move through the course. And massing that vocab is what's going to facilitate your best outcomes without a shadow of a doubt.
Hopefully that answered that, Claire, but feel free to come on if it hasn't. I think following on from that as well, we had a lot of questions on how they can maintain the focus with students that possibly are at the slightly weaker end, or even the mixed, if you have a mixed ability class.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I mean, I know you touched on how you can kind of, add colour to a lesson, but I don't know if you've got any other tips as well.
Yeah, so what I would say is probably 3 things. The first is that the teacher's guide, which is available online on the Bloomsbury website, one of the things that the teacher's guide does, in fact, I'm just going to screen share very quickly. Here we go, speedy. So here is the website, and down here on the companion website is all the links to all the stuff. And the teacher's guide page, one of the things that the teacher guide does is, first of all, this introduction to it here actually goes through the structure of the course and the different difficulty points of the different tasks, because every type of exercise, additional language A or B or C, or the Latin sentences or the Latin stories, have been constructed at a different difficulty point. And as a general rule, stop sharing. As a general rule, this Latin stories are the easiest. And the reason why the Latin stories are the easiest is, A, you're dealing with a familiar sense line. And when you're teaching the Latin stories, it's really worth making sure the students know the story in advance, because students actually really enjoy rereading a story where they already know the opening, or the kind of like framework of it. But the Latin story is the easiest because the vocab comes around again and again and again. They're kind of very deliberately repetitive with vocab. So whatever words the students know, they get loads of return because they get to use that word multiple times within the same story. And it's the stories where the students actually need to know least grammar. And if you've got a weekend class, what I quite often do is a lot of plenary reading of the stories together, because you can scaffold it and help the students bowl on through. The Latin sentences look like they're going to be easier superficially because they're shorter. But the Latin sentences are deliberately pitched to be harder than the stories, because the Latin sentences were where I could construct material that would encourage teachers to get students to look at detail, because the number of grammatical endings you can flex around much more if you're not stuck within a linear sense narrative. And within the additional language, the A materials are the easiest, the B are the next hardest, and the C are harder still. So if you've got weaker end students constructing lessons largely out of culture and context materials, always great. The Latin stories and the A and some of the B exercises are probably the best way to go. And with the Latin sentences, maybe only ever use 1 or 2 of them in isolation to demonstrate particular points. But if you try and chug through the Latin sentences from top down to bottom, you're going to find per batch of sentences, there are moments which are deliberately there. So if you've got a group of really bright kids, you can be like, oh, watch out for that trap, watch out for that trap, you know. So beware, the Latin sentences are designed to be stretching and the stories are designed to be very inclusive.
Fab. We've got a hand up. Bartholomew, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. We're trying to phase in De Romanis instead of CLC with our year 7s just for the year, and I'm the one that's trialing it, and I'd like your advice on how far through the course you think would be worth getting, both in terms of setting them up to go onto the JT1 next year and starting that, and also more importantly getting them involved with the extra material bits and pieces, because I've found that I've been really boring with it, and kind of gone against what you've tried to do with it. So if you could just let me know, how far through would be a good place. We have 2 35-minute lessons a week, and they have a half an hour prep a week as well as like 10 minutes of vocab.
And are you going to join in with JT at the start of book 1?
Yeah, so we'll basically use the beginning of year 8 to revise everything covered in year 7.
Yeah, absolutely. So it doesn't, and in a sense, it doesn't really matter, because when they move into John Taylor 1, they're going to start from scratch anyway. So I would say go at a pace that is comfortable, but students like a certain frequency of something new and interesting. So I think if you, on 2 35-minute lessons, I think if you stretch a chapter out for longer than 8 to 9 teaching weeks, it's going to feel to the students like you're spending a very long time talking about the same theme, because it's going to be the same concepts, particularly for culture and content, which are coming to the fore again and again. So we move through it with 2 35-minute lessons. We move through it with about kind of 8 to 9 teaching weeks allocated to a chapter. Okay. But within that 8 or 9 teaching weeks, 2 will be spent on the background content, and at least 1.5 will be spent on revision at the end. Okay. So we try and do, kind of a yellow box a lesson basically. But I would say see on the appetite of your students, see how kind of keen they are. But I wouldn't, throughout the board at Key Stage 3, I wouldn't get overly bogged down by the mastery concept for anything other than vocab. They need to master vocab, and they need to get increasingly confident with labels. But if they're not absolutely on point with all of their ablative case endings, there's plenty of time to feed that data if the framework and the labels are strong.
Yeah, so, and then in terms of teaching the mythological stuff in the 2 weeks you said, is that time that's discrete time? Is it put aside?
So we put it aside largely because we want 2 weeks to build the vocab. It's largely there as a buffer, so we can spread out that vocab learning. Yeah. You can actually intersperse it as you go through the chapter, and what we do is we loop back round to it every time we get to a Latin story, as sometimes we pull in the sources or images and so on. But that 2 weeks is really to kind of set the blockbuster narrative and get kids interested in, who were the gods and why is that interesting? And again, if I go back to the teacher's guide very quickly, here we go. So not quite as dexterous with this as I should be. If I go back to the teacher's guide, when you get into the chapter by chapter teacher's guide like this one, in the teacher's guide is always an overview of what the chapter's all about, but it also goes through how to begin, but even better, what's likely to be interesting.
Sure.
And I think with any kind of teaching planning, ask yourself, what's likely to be hard, what do they actually need to know, and therefore how can I mitigate the difficulty, and what's going to be interesting. And pulling the interest to the fore is massive at Key Stage 3. You want them to realise this is a subject not just about endings, but about big, interesting ideas that actually blow their mind sometimes. So I would think about what's going to appeal to them as interest, because our Year 7 do find the content really interesting and thought-provoking.
Yeah. So, I'm sorry, last one. So is that right at the beginning of the term, basically at the beginning of the teaching block, you do 2 weeks of cultural stuff and vocab?
Exactly. And there's various ways you can do it. And in the teacher's guide, am I still sharing? I am, jolly good. In the teacher's guide, at the end of each chapter, we talk about what you can leave out, by the way, what's difficult, how best to teach it. We go through all that. We talk about if you're short of time, what to prioritise. I hope that's going to be quite useful. But here with the Latin stories, we also talk about how you can weave things back in. Every time you get to a Latin story, what could you go back to if you want to boost and content understanding. And if you don't want to give 2 discrete weeks to dealing with the culture and context, you could structure it this way.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, everyone.
That's right. Excellent to have a question.
Yeah. Catherine, I don't know whether you want to have show you some of the online resources as well, and now you've got it open.
Yeah, why not? Let's do it.
Maybe some particular resources that you could use for teaching the grammar, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the online resources, there's kind of all sorts of stuff here. Culture and context resources supplement the teaching. With the language stuff specifically, things like this here, the Quizlet links, really useful. There's ready-made Quizlet slides for all the vocab. So if you're working on vocab, 5 minutes of Quizlet, the start of each lesson can be really constructive. But for the teaching of the language specifically, probably the 2 things that are going to be most useful are, first of all, the principal worksheets, the additional language. And as I say, the additional language is not necessarily the hard bit. The A and B are actually very straightforward because they tend to be mono-processing. You're just thinking about one thing at a time, so they can be really, really good for the lower end. But the Latin text for each story here, this gives you a malleable copy of the Latin text for each story, and it allows you to use the Latin stories in a way where you can bowl on through the translation, but you can also highlight certain words. So if you do want to pull out a bit of the grammar, if you've been teaching infinitives in chapter 3 and you're doing the story about Aeneas and the Penates, you can bowl through it, but you can also say, tell me, why have I highlighted those 5 words? What do they all have in common? Oh, it's the RE ending. Yes, it's an infinitive. How are we going to translate them all? Let's just do those 5 in isolation, and then you can do the whole story. So using the stories as an opportunity to focus quite light touch on the grammar can work very well with that malleable resource there. So there's loads and loads and loads, but out of all this, I think probably if you're kind of trying to get your head around the different approaches, I really do recommend a quick scan of the teacher's guide, because particularly this advice about how to navigate, how to flex, what to leave out, what to focus on, what to bring to the fore, we've done our best to go into that in hopefully quite a useful degree of detail in that teacher's guide.
Excellent. We've only got a few minutes left. If anybody else would like to jump on and ask a question, now is the time. But we've also got a few people that are new and just started to teach with Romanis, which is great. We had a question about what's the best tip for first-time users. So I don't know whether you want to finish with that, Catherine.
I think the best tip for first-time users is, don't think I kind of call it the tyranny of the 10. So when you're doing a textbook and there's an exercise with 10 sentences, don't feel you have to do it all, because a lot of teachers feel you've got to turn the pages and do everything on the page and the rest of it. And as a textbook, De Romanis isn't designed to be like that. So my best tip for first-time users is teach from the heart. Choose the bits of it that you find most interesting, that you want to engage with, and bring those to the fore. Because what I've seen in years of observing other teachers is there isn't actually one right way to do a lesson. The lessons that work are the lessons the teachers believe in. And trust yourself and teach kind of according to the stuff that you think your students are going to like. Bring out the background if that's the thing you love. Do the continuous reading if that's the thing you love. If you love grammatical accuracy, do the English into Latin, but trust your own judgment of selectivity, because if you believe in the lessons you're delivering, the kids will naturally buy into them too.
Great, thank you. Okay. If anybody's got any questions, you can jump on, but I think we'll end it there. And I just want to thank everyone again for attending, and thank especially Catherine for your time once again. If anybody has any ideas for further webinar topics or anything that you're struggling with, feel free to email. Like I said, we're going to aim hopefully for a one-termly email to help you and support you as you go along. So thank you so much. And also the other thing I wanted to say before I leave is that if you are a first-time user of Romanis, then make sure you go onto the companion website, and under the webinar tab, you've got the previous webinars that we did last year as well. So they're full of useful tips. So do take a watch of those. And I'm going to let you all go and enjoy your Tuesday evening.